Welcome to Nwa Cane Corsos podcast, where we talk all things dogs.
Hello. We're back for another show, Nwa Cane Corsos podcast, where we talk all things dogs. Hey, everybody. We're back with another one. This show is guest hosted by our normal guest host, Lamont of La Potenza Cane Corso. Lamont, what's going on?
What's going on, bro? How you doing?
Not much. We doing good.
How you doing, Mike?
I'm doing great, man. Thank you guys for having me on.
Yeah, Michael Ellis is in the house today.
Good.
Yeah, and we're glad to have him here. All right. So as usual, we're gonna jump right into it. Hey, Michael, could you tell us a little bit about yourself and how you got into dog training?
Sure thing. So here, I'll give you the condensed version. So when I was 12 or 13, wanted a dog, convinced the parents finally to let me get a German Shepherd. The deal was that I take care of it and train it. So I started taking some obedience classes from the local German Shepherd dog club. And then I got all involved in confirmation, showing American German Shepherds all through like junior high and high school, got into AKC obedience. And then when I was just out of getting out of high school, I was at a dog show and saw a Schutzen and police dog demo at the time, a German dog sport and a police dog demo. And I thought, okay, that's cool. I want to do that. So I went and found a local club that did that work. And none of the dogs I had were suitable. So I started doing decoy work for them a bunch. And that started me down the path of kind of protection sport and things like that. And it was a hobby all through college. And once I got out of college, I got asked at a certain point, a club that I used to work with had a bunch of new members, and they asked if I'd come in and do a little like workshop for the new members. And I did that, and it went pretty well. And so another club asked me if I'd do a seminar. So it kind of gradually built up steam a little bit until I was traveling full-time, giving seminars to dog clubs, police departments, military, service dog organizations, all that kind of stuff around the country. And I did that for almost 13 years, traveling full-time. And near the end of that, I was doing 40 or 45 seminars a year on the road. And I just had burnt out quite a bit on travel. And so I decided to open a school. And since I'd been coaching dog trainers for the previous 12 or 14 years, I opened a school for dog trainers. So in 2009, I opened the Michael Ellis School for Dog Trainers. And for the last 14 years or so, I've been running that full time. We had week and 2 week long kind of intensive classes on specific subjects. And then we also had what we called our immersion program, which was a 5-month long full-time program where students would come twice a year. I ran that program. And then just last year, I've decided it's a little bit of time for me to slow down a touch. So I'm backing off a little bit on we canceled our long-term program, and I just launched a new subscription membership service where I'm kind of putting all the content. So I'm putting recorded versions of our old classes into there, but that's the kind of trajectory, right? And so,
Going more online.
Yeah, I am now, right? So I resisted for years. I mean, you guys are obviously recognize that this is how people are getting their information now. But forever, I did everything kind of in person. That's the way I came up. I was used to that. Like, I think dog training, you lose something if you're only learning about dog training over the internet, and you're not out there putting your hands on dogs and working, getting in-person coaching. But that said, that's the world in which we live in. So I'm sort of at a spot where I'm doing more online stuff than I ever did before. Yeah.
Right. But you encourage getting out there and doing something, working with the dogs or people.
There is no substitute for hands-on personal experience. You got to feel it. You got to try it and do it over and over again and experiment with it, figure out how to handle the things that come up. And no amount of watching video or remote coaching will get you there. It can help you jump over some stages. Like, it can help you get information really rapid. We can get information faster than ever, but you can't really speed up the actual fluency of learning to dog train, which is it's a physical discipline. It requires just practice and time to get good at it, and experience. So I think one of the things that, and I could talk about this for too long probably, but one of the things for me that is a little bit problematic about the internet is most of the time people aren't showing real-time training, the whole process.
Yeah.
They're editing
because
it.
that's right.
They're giving you a bunch of little highlight reel clips. And so that gives new trainers an unrealistic idea of what dog training is. That's not what dog training is. It's kind of slow and steady, incremental progress through repetition. And if something's really dramatic, then usually you're doing something wrong, right? I always say good dog training is undramatic. Yeah.
So Mike, I'm a trainer, nothing like you. I'm a very basic trainer. I train a dog here and there, but in the world that we live in now, I'm sure you get this all the time. I want my dog protection trained.
Yeah.
I look at protection training like everybody having a gun.
Yeah.
Everybody doesn't need one. Everybody doesn't need a protection trained dog. So in the situations that I'm in, I don't do protection training for everyone. If they're more, and this is not to knock any more fur moms, fur dads, and they pet, their dog is simply a pet. The last thing they need is a protection dog that they're taking to the dog park, and those kind of things. How do you handle it when a family is dead set on doing protection work, and number one, the dog isn't set up to be a protection dog, and two, them as a family don't understand the dynamics of what it is having a protection dog in the home? How do you handle that situation this day and time? Back then, we would say, I ain't doing it. You don't need it. Be done with it. And nobody's feelings was hurt and they moved on. This day and time, this day and time.
So I look at my job as an educator. And so it doesn't matter who I'm dealing with. I'm dealing with a client, a family that's got a dog, or I'm dealing with somebody that wants to become a professional dog trainer. It's telling them what dog training really is. So I try to just be straight up honest with them about, one, the amount of effort it takes, one, that there's only certain types of dogs that can do it and be safe, right? So like I talk about the safety aspects of it, certainly. Like somebody can get hurt. Like this is a long process that requires a lot of effort from you, requires a lot of responsibility once the dog's trained, and we absolutely have to have the right dog for it, right? If we do this with the wrong dog, you just make a dangerous dog, right? At that point. And so I'm very clear about all that. Very rarely does somebody come to you with a dog that's suitable. Like it's super uncommon. And so as I go through, if I were evaluating the dog, evaluating their living situation, that's another thing. Like, do they have kids? Like, what's their day-to-day life look like with the dog? All those kinds of things are questions that I'm going to ask. And I'm going to just be really straightforward about, okay, here's what the process looks like. While it's happening and being developed, this dog is going to be dangerous at various periods of time because we don't have all the pieces done yet. And then as you finish that work, now there's the responsibility of living with that dog. It's like living with a gun, and that means you can't just treat it like a dog. You can't just go to the dog park. You can't have a big party and a bunch of friends over and have people getting drunk in your house. You know, your uncle can't come to the back door in the middle of the night and unannounced, like
and have to pee.
That's going to make you change your life. And so I think over the years, I've discouraged 95% of the people. Your analogy of if not everybody needs a gun, for sure. And it's true there. And I think most people don't need a protection dog, and not a real protection dog, for sure.
And unfortunately, where it's gotten away from is back in the day, you had protection breeds, guardian breeds, the Rottweiler and the Shepherd and those type of things. And they were actually bred with the the characteristics and the qualities that they did the protection naturally. And you didn't have to necessarily have formal training when it came to protection work. Joe, can I ask one more question?
Yeah, do your thing.
Real quick. Okay. So, Mike, I know a lot of things right now I'm seeing in Dallas and some other places as well when it comes to trainers. And it's a lot of them now are going to jail because of the methods that they're using. They're looked at as abuse. I think you've done it long enough to see that the methods of training have changed. And the methods back then were harder to get a dog to do certain things. The methods were extreme. I'll use that word. Throughout the years, I think we've learned that there are different methods. There are different tools that you can use. Lot of praise and play and those kind of things. Back then it was harsh. If you're going to bite, damn it, bite. And this is how we were going to make you bite. We were going to push you to the brink of death sometimes to get it out of you. Those methods aren't being used anymore without consequences. What do you see right now when it comes to trainers who have been, or that are still kind of stuck on using those methods? What would you tell the public when it comes to, if they say, hey, that's abuse? But even as a trainer, we know, hey, that method is harsh, but it works. I get why it's being done. It's not acceptable now. How can you respond to those people that says, no, that's absolutely abuse. That's not training?
Let me piggyback on that question. Sorry, Mike.
Sure.
Because that's a good question. When you go into that, would you just go on ahead and cover positive and negative reinforcement for me?
Sure.
Okay.
So I'll get into that. So I think some of that training, there's traditional training that was more pressure-based, for sure. More what we would call escape and avoidance training, using negative reinforcement to create new behavior. And using punishment to limit options in dogs. And so there was a traditional way in which that was done. And that work was less pleasant, not as much fun for the dog. It requires somebody of very good physical skills. And so I think that there's still some of that type of training that can be done humanely and fairly to the dog. And are there better ways to do it? Yes. Now part of my mission is to educate people about modern methods in dog training in general and what the strengths and weaknesses of any way in which you would approach training are, right? So every kind of approach out there, those traditional approaches were around and are still around because they do work in certain circumstances. But when they are misapplied, and they are frequently misapplied, then it is abuse. That's true. Like if somebody's not doing that well, they're not clear, the teaching hasn't been correct, then you're just abusing a dog who has no idea what you're trying to get it to do, right? And so for me, it's understanding how dogs learn globally and then just spreading education. And although you want to stop people from abusing dogs, and those methodologies should not be the go-to at this stage, I think if we immediately just vilify every aspect of that, then you won't be able to reach those people. Those people are not ready. They're not going to just suddenly toss out everything they know and start from scratch. And so our goal is to have the entire dog training community come together, sort of police ourselves in a sense, where we can go like, hey, that training's not appropriate and there are better ways, and we can help you find better ways to do this stuff so you can understand that, right? And good dog training now that rarely is using either of the kind of restrictive camps, right? So the best dog training is not people that are using purely traditional methods where they say no food, no toys, none of that. The dog has to do it because they respect me. They have to do it because they have to do it. They should want to work for me. That kind of old school mentality where everything is negative reinforcement and positive punishment. And the flip side of that, let's say the polar opposite of that, is these people that are purely force-free, like no animal should have any stress in its life. Like you can do everything with positive reinforcement and negative punishment, the giving and withholding of rewards. And that's equally limiting, right? Both of those things. Now, one could argue that the dogs that are in the force-free thing aren't being abused, physically abused, but frequently they're not being set up to be successful in the world either, right? And we're not preparing them for life in a sense, because life isn't stress-free. And so to me, the best training now is people that understand all four quadrants of operant or instrumental learning, how dogs learn that way. They understand Pavlovian or classical conditioning. They understand manipulating emotion and mood in dogs, and they're picking and choosing all the pieces so that they're teaching in an environment that's as stress-free as possible. And then they're adding consequence as necessary after the dog has some kind of understanding of what's expected to them. And their communication is clear and consistent. And that's basically what good dog training is at the end of the day. And all of the most kind of innovative training that you see now, where you could step back, you could show the dog to anybody. You could walk that dog out in front of anybody and they go, that dog knows their job. They know it well. They're under control and they look like they enjoy the work the whole way through. When you see that, everybody can see it. And that's done by people that understand all of it. They're not limiting themselves to traditional methods exclusively or force-free methods exclusively. They're picking and choosing the pieces of that puzzle that best suit the dog that's in front of them and the goal that they have.
Gotcha. So what is the importance of properly condition a correction marker in dog training?
So, gosh, there's a whole bunch of things. So markers in general are hugely useful part of our communication tool, right? So both signal and markers, you'll hear people call that signaling, right? But it's conditioned reinforcers, conditioned punishers, markers, signals for consequences. All those things are the same, right? And so with rewards, both being able to signal to the dog exactly when they're right and they're getting a reward, super useful in terms of improving timing. It's not always feasible for us to give rewards to dogs right at the right time. And then signaling punishment is also super important for a variety of reasons. One, sometimes it's not feasible to give punishment right at the right time. So there's what I call attribution, what I call like credit assignment is what I would call this, right? So what a signal does, either a reward marker or a punishment marker, signal for correction, is it allows me to tell the dog exactly what it is that they're getting rewarded or punished for, right? Gotcha. And so if I'm not using a marker, then I have to actually deliver the correction right at the point in time when the dog does something wrong, right? And that's sometimes easy and sometimes it's not, depending on what the situation is, right? But if I have a marker, I can signal right when it happens, and then the correction itself could follow after it. And so then the dog knows that whatever it was doing at the time it heard that sound is what the punishment or the reward is for, right? And so that allows me to assign credit to the behavior that I want to either reward or punish. So that's one piece of the puzzle. The other piece of the puzzle is if you just correct a dog without signaling it, without saying no or wrong or whatever ahead of time, without marking it, and you just correct them, then sometimes you surprise the dog. And when you surprise the dog like that, sometimes they associate the correction with something other than what I wanted them to associate it with. It could have been something in the environment. It could have been something they were focused on, right? And I wanted to correct them for not listening to me. And instead, because they were focused on some distraction when I corrected them and I surprised them with the correction, they think the distraction did it. We call this superstitious associations. And now the dog's worried about the situation because they didn't take the way I wanted them to take it. So by signaling it, by saying no when I'm going to do it, one, I prepare them. They hear the sound and they go, uh-oh, whatever I'm doing now isn't correct. And the consequence that comes after, they associate with that instead of other things in the environment, which is something we really want there. And then finally, another piece of the puzzle is if I signal a correction, then I can use a much less intense correction to the same effect.
Oh, gotcha.
So this is really important. Like the neurobiologically, they've studied this and they can actually watch the stress levels in animals when they receive electrical shocks, for instance, right? And if it's signaled and they know it's coming and they know it's under their control, it produces significantly less stress. And I don't need the same level. So if I were to just to correct a dog, I would have to give a certain level of correction. But if I signal the dog that they made a mistake, no, and then I give them a correction, that correction can be really light. It can be super, it doesn't have to be intense at all. And you have to actually downregulate it. You actually have to turn that volume down on it. And it allows me to get away with much less intense physical punishers because the dog is preparing. As soon as I say no, they're like, oh man,
No, it's coming.
I knew I did something wrong. So then it's like I had a friend that said, it's like the walk to the woodshed, right? What's worse, the whooping or the walk? The anticipation of it. It's the walk, right? And so and by signaling, you're doing that, right? You're going like, and then all I have to do is go boink, boink, little tiny correction. And the dog's like, oh man, I knew I was wrong. Sorry, right? And so there's a whole host of benefits to signaling both rewards and punishments to dogs. Hugely important piece of and no, I don't know anybody that's doing very good modern dog training that isn't using markers or signaling now in their training. It just cleans up so much stuff, right? And there are other benefits as well. Like I can, when I need for a reward-based end of it, when I can put rewards out of sight because I don't need to have them there. If I'm using rewards and I'm not using a marker, a signal, then I have to give the reward to the dog right when they do what I want them to do. And that means the reward has to be out and ready. Well, then the dogs are aware when there are rewards there or not. So another big piece of the puzzle is I move the rewards out of sight. My dog does a behavior, I mark it, and then I get the reward out afterwards. So the same thing as with the punishment. I don't have to be there with perfect physical timing. I just have to be able to tell the dog it's coming. And then they know it's coming. And that allows me all kinds of freedom in other ways as well.
Gotcha. Yeah. Lamont, you got something?
I do. And I'm sure, Mike, you've probably seen this more than anything now. You see so many dogs now that come in for training that people are bringing in that are nervous, skittish. I'm seeing an influx of that in my breed. I'm seeing it in other guardian breeds as well. That the confidence, the treatment, whether they've been humanized, some have been partially corrected. How do you handle that when it comes to a dog that needs that kind of training? Because what I find is you're doing as much therapy on the dog as you are, teaching commands. True enough, their confidence comes from them learning commands and it builds it. But you're doing more therapy on a dog now than you were back then. Are you seeing that in your line of work out there where you are?
100%, right? So there's always a lot of nervous dogs, but also there's a variety of factors I think that contribute to that now in modern society, right? So one is less discriminate breeding for sure. Like more dogs out there, more people just breeding dogs because they've got them regardless of their temperament. So there is like kind of some indiscriminate and accidental breedings where dogs that shouldn't probably have been bred are bred. So there's a genetic component to that, certainly. But also how we live with dogs is really different than we ever did before, right? So when I came up as a kid with dogs, people weren't taking their dogs everywhere. Like the dogs weren't out at the farmer's market walking around you, sitting at the coffee shop with you. Like none of that stuff was happening. Pretty much the only people that were taking their dogs out to places were people that were into dog activities, whether it's dog shows, that kind of stuff. The average person in the suburbs and stuff like that had a dog. The dog stayed in the backyard for the most part, went for a walk around the block maybe occasionally, but they weren't. Now people take their dogs everywhere with them all the time, right? And then on top of that, we know that early socialization is important for dogs too, right? So we've learned that if dogs are exposed properly to certain things while their brain is developing, those dogs are better when they're adults, right? So they're being properly socialized and exposed. And so we recognize that when I came up in dog training, people didn't do puppy socialization. You couldn't take a dog to a dog training class until it was at least 6 months old, right? They didn't have little puppy classes at that point in time, right? And so that early stuff is good, but also means that sometimes people are putting puppies, and especially like a lot of guardian breeds and things like that, they're meant to be a little bit suspicious. They're meant, that's how they do their job, right? They're meant to go like, hey, I know that person, I don't know that person, right? There's some degree of suspicion and territoriality that's natural for those dogs. And that's worse when they're younger. When they're younger, they're a little less secure, and they're more likely to be a little like, ooh, I don't know about that person, or I don't know about that thing. And if you're carting them around all the time and you're not doing a good job of that, you can actually make it worse. Sometimes they're putting young puppies in over their head. You know, it's like taking the shy kid in class saying, hey, you got to go out with and meet 100 new people all the time. And so sometimes there's some over socialization. So you can have under socialization where people didn't expose the dog at all. You can have over socialization where people are putting the dog in over their head. That can make problems, but we see a ton of it. The other thing is that people are taking the dogs out and walking the dogs around a lot before they have any control on them. So now you can have a dog out in the world and the dog gets spooked by something. You have no way of communicating to the dog to do something else because they don't have any training yet because they're young, and they start barking at stuff, and it can get worse and it can kind of spiral. And so for me, the most important thing is the therapy first, to your point. Like, the behaviors have to follow after the right mindset. Teaching behaviors to a dog that's not in the right mindset is super unproductive. You know, if you were really nervous and afraid and shy, and I tried to get you up in front of a classroom and teach you stuff, you think you're going to learn well? No, you're not going to learn well. If you're a person, that's going to be a horrible situation. But we do it to dogs all the time. Dog trainers get in a dog. They said some client drops a dog off. The dog's terrified of them, the new place, everything. And what do? They go straight to trying to teach it to sit and down and everything else, right? Like, no. Like, you got to do some therapy first. You and the dog have to build a relationship. The dog has to like you. The dog has to want to do stuff. You got to get them comfortable so they're in the right mindset to learn, right?
I have one here now from the pound, and the family adopted it, and we put it in the 4-week boarding train. So of course they checked on it the first day. The second day, she said, well, Lamont, what did y'all do today? I said, she sat in my lap.
Yeah, exactly. Yes, you got it. That's exactly it.
She said, wait a minute, y'all had to do more than that. I said, well, we did. We sat on the porch. She said, and then what? I said, we sat back in the house. She said, huh? She said, Lamont, you got to start training. I said, no, I can't. Because you dropped me off a dog that needs therapy more than anything. I have to get the dog to trust me first.
Yeah.
I can't go into telling him things. And the dog had been abused, like clearly physically abused. I said, so there's some steps that I have to take as a trainer that I might not necessarily explain to you. But just know we're making progress.
But I think it's important that we do explain it to them, right? So that's the other thing too. Like, it's hard, like, as dog trainers, we're like, especially when you're dealing with clients, a lot of them have no idea what dog training really is.
Yeah.
And this is a family that is one of those families that, and they didn't have a clue. And once they brought food because they were feeding, specific food, and I have them to bring it every 5 days. So we sat down, and once I broke it down to them, because they're an older couple, and I broke it down to him, but he was from Italy and he was used to harsh training, and he said, well, she doesn't train the way I train. I said, I understand. I said, but it's like, it would be like you getting a child that had been abused from, and now you're a foster parent. If she spilled milk, if she spilled milk, you wouldn't walk over there and whap her with a fly swatter. Yeah. You would comfort her and let her know, hey, it's okay. I said, so those are the things that, you have to do as well with an animal. So I appreciate you explaining that too. I'm sure it's a lot of people, and they're the ones sitting there saying, that's my dog.
Yeah.
As far as no confidence. But how would you encourage them to move forward in their day-to-day activities with that dog, as far as exposing it to the outside world and building confidence?
Right. So the first step is to build, and for me always, is to build some value in you and the dog doing something together, right? So we usually start off with just basic engagement. Like the dog wants to pay attention to me, wants something from me. Like they're here. They're like, hey, what do you got for me? And then we start to construct some basic behaviors that are with the handler. So instead of going out in the world and saying like, hey, let's go meet a bunch of people, let's go see some stuff, I have them take the dog to new places, and be careful about how they choose those places in the beginning, and then just do the thing that you and the dog do well together. So the dog likes to play, or if you've been teaching like walk next to you for a piece of food and look at me, or if you've been doing some target work or something easy for the dog that's really basic that the dog enjoys, and you've built some value in, and you have something that they want to do, and then have them do that in just new places. Don't try to force them to interact with other stuff. Don't try to push it. Like one of the things that when people see a dog that's anxious or has some fear-based problems, they think they have to work on it. Right. And then a lot of times, the more you work on it, the worse you get. Right. You sensitize instead of desensitize. So you need to make sure that the dog's having good experiences. And sometimes just having a good experience someplace new is totally enough. You don't have to get them close to the thing that makes them nervous. You don't have to have them meet somebody new or have them feed the dog. None of that stuff. Just like get out, have a good experience with me in new places. And then you just build on that a little bit at a time. And then certainly as the dog starts to have obedience, that can play a role too. But you have to be really careful about asking for obedience that isn't very fluent in the dog when they're anxious, right? Because what tends to happen if you have a dog that's a little bit afraid or a little stressed out in a situation, you ask for an obedience behavior that's not very strong in the dog. And of course they don't do it because they're like, I can't listen to you right now. That thing over there is freaking me out. And then because they don't do it, people start correcting them. And now it's worse. Now the dog says, I thought this was a bad situation, and now I'm sure it's a bad situation, right? So obedience can help with that stuff, but it has to be pretty well constructed, and the dog has to like it, and you have to ask for it when the dog's not super off. They haven't gone off the cliff. They may be a little bit anxious. You're far enough away from something that they can actually perform it. And then they can gain confidence through obedience over time. But people try to use it right away. They have a dog. They've basically just taught the dog to sit. And now they take the dog out, and the dog's a little nervous about somebody over there, and they're going sit, and the dog's not sitting, and they're pulling on the dog, and the whole thing gets all messy really fast, right? It has absolutely the opposite of the intended effect.
So I got a question. Y'all was tapping in on something, on a question of mine that I was going to ask you, and that's misinformation. How concerned are you about the oversimplification and misrepresentation of dog training? People are making it thinking it's something that it isn't.
It's my life's work right now. Like ultimately, I'm so concerned with it, right? Like we live in a culture that's interested in oversimplifying things.
Right.
We live in a culture that's into instant gratification. Like I want it now. I want it yesterday. Like that kind of thing, instead of like, hey, this is a process. Dog training is a relationship, and it's a journey, and you spend your time in process. The finished product is sort of not the point even. It just happens if you commit to the journey. And it's slow, it's incremental. If it's done properly, it's slow, it's incremental, and it's thoughtful. And you and the dog should be enjoying it. Even which doesn't mean, of course, that there's no pressure, and it doesn't mean that there's no obligation. We all have things in our life that we love to do, and there are rules around those things, and there are consequences if we don't follow the rules, right? But that doesn't damage our desire to do the activity. And well done dog training's like that. It's a partnership. It's doing together.
COVID developed a lot of trainers. We call them YouTube trainers. They develop a lot of YouTube trainers.
and oversimplification is a marketing strategy too. Like somebody says, they want to give you this like overly simplified version of something because they can sell it. They can say like, this method works with every dog. This does like this kind of whatever that is, which is just not the way it works. And so for me, I welcome interactions with people where we can talk about what really dog training is. And like the material that I'm putting out now is all kind of unedited. So I have a video training journal for my current dog right now from 8 weeks. He's a year old now, and I'm filming all my training sessions with him, and then putting him
Even
in.
your mistakes?
All the bad stuff.
What are you doing? Are you crazy? Trainers, we don't make mistakes. Our videos don't show mistakes.
Oh, dude.
Come on. Come on, Mike. What are you doing? What are you doing?
Yep.
Yeah.
But that's connected to that same idea, though, because people just think like they see bang, 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 and then they see this finished product and they think, oh, yeah, I want that.
Right. And I can do it.
Yeah.
And I can do that.
Yep.
Yeah, I can do it. I seen him do it. I seen him do it on that 20-second video. I know I know I can do it. I know I can do it. Oh man.
I just
well, guys, I'm gonna have to exit.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah.
I'm gonna have to exit, and I thank y'all so much, Mike. It was great talking to you, Joe. I appreciate you giving me the opportunity to learn something as well, and y'all enjoyed.
Thanks, Lamont.
I'm sure the fans will get a lot more knowledge.
All
nice
right.
to meet, man.
Yes, sir. All right. It's me and you, Mike.
All right, let's do it.
Okay. So I wanted to ask you about dog training. In your mind, is it just like is it more like just a process? I know I'm gonna do this. Everything is gonna line up every time I train a dog, or is it more like a journey where every dog is not the same?
Every dog is not the same. So every dog is a little bit different, but underneath all of that is a kind of skeleton of a process.
Okay.
So the way I look at it is analogy that I use all the time is like music. Like if somebody wants to play improvisational jazz, they don't just jump out and play jazz, right? You learned scales and you had to play all your scales over and over again, right? Until you mastered those. And then you played traditional pieces. And then you start to master kind of all the feel of it. And then you go off script a little bit. You're like, I feel I can play with this. I can go this direction. I have experience to know this works in these situations and this work. And dog training is kind of like that. There's a core of it. There are principles and governing ideas that are going to be true for all dogs. Like dogs learn within certain sets of rules, and there's certain kinds of techniques that we've developed to work with them. Right. And so there's a path that you start off on. And in the beginning, you have to kind of stick with it while you get good at it. Like one of the things that's hard is if you tell somebody right from the beginning that you got to try something new with every dog, then they never get good at any of the basic mechanics. They can't play their scales.
Right.
So new dog trainers need to learn their scales. And then once you learn those, then you realize you go, okay, I've seen this kind of dog before. Instead of going that way, I'm going to go this way a little bit. And you improvise a touch and you come around. And that whole process is a give and take and a flow. And you learn to adjust to the dog in front of you based on past experiences, and you gather more tools and more ideas over time. And then you get to that point where it's a journey. Like, and you sort of let go of outcomes a little bit. In the beginning, of course, you're very outcome focused. You're learning something new. This has to make that happen. This has to make that happen. But eventually you know that if you trust the process over time, you'll get there.
Right.
And in the beginning, that's a little hard for people. But that's sort of how I look at it. And there is some simplification that's necessary for a new trainer. I couldn't hit you with all the information at once. It'd be overwhelming, right? You couldn't function. There's no way. None of it would be just too much to make sense of. So they give somebody, a new trainer, something to focus on. They do that a little bit till they get good at it. And then you say, oh, by the way, it's not always like that. And here's how it's different. And then they get good at that. And you say, oh, and by the way, that's not always like that. And you get good at that. And oh, by the way, and that happens for the rest of your career, right?
Right. And I know you can get pretty deep in on this, but I wanted to see your perspective on science and dog training, like as far as neuroscience and things like that. How has that enhanced you along the way?
Yeah, I think it science isn't necessary to be a good dog trainer, but if you love dog training, then understanding why things work and why they don't becomes really interesting. So the current science is fascinating to me, and I always dig it when I get a scientific explanation for something you'd seen at work. You in your personal experience, you've seen this happen, and you're like, I wonder what's going on there. And then science has an explanation for it, and you're like, oh, that's fascinating. That's cool, right? I like that.
Right.
And so I think it can help do some things like that. The other thing that it does, and science is like a process of evaluating information. Like science isn't a set of beliefs; it's a method for testing ideas.
Right.
Can we come up with a hypothesis? We test it to collect data, see if that's true. Then we modify the hypothesis. So it's constantly in flux. It's always changing because we're always getting new information, right? And so science moves forward because it's not a stuck place. It's constantly evolving. And so what's happened now, I think that's helpful is we recognize some of the places in which you're battling against what's biologically natural for an animal. And as a good dog trainer, you want to stay out of that place as much as possible.
Okay.
Anytime I'm fighting against the dog's natural biology, I'm going to lose. Right. And so if you understand the science, sometimes you'll recognize those places where persisting in what you're doing is not going to be effective. And it helps. And it also can help you explain to people that are skeptical. The other part of it as well, the other thing about science is you don't need it to train dogs. But if I'm trying to convince somebody of an idea or explain to somebody why something works, and some people don't care. Like if you could have a client that wouldn't care at all about why things work, just tell me what to do. Right? They're like, I don't care. Just tell me what to do. But there are other clients that are like, I don't know. How come why? Why does that work?
Yeah.
And people can't commit to it unless they know why. So if you have good command of the science, then sometimes that helps you explain to somebody in a way that makes sense to them. Right?
Okay. So you said something. What are your perspectives on the strengths and limitations of different dog sports like Mondeo Ring, French Ring, PSA? How do they differ in terms of the dog's engagement and judging criteria?
How much time we got? So those are that's a big subject. Right?
I'm sorry. Yeah.
So each of those sports, and what Joe's talking about here are some of the traditional protection sports, right? So protection work in dog training has a long history from basically the late 1800s, early 1900s was really when it launched. And it was mostly a European phenomenon, right? Western Europe. And so a lot of the Western European countries had long traditions of protection disciplines. And they originally started out trying to make dogs for police work, but over time they developed sports. And so the French have a sport, the Belgians have a sport, the Dutch have a sport, the Germans have a sport, and all of those sports were originally designed to select dogs for police work. And then over the years, and they all started around the same time, early 1900s. So it's been more than 100 years that they've been doing those sports. So there's a long history and tradition there. In other areas in the US, for instance, it's newer here. There were some police and military dogs in the 50s and 60s and stuff like that, and a little bit of stuff before that, but not the same way. And sports didn't land here in the US. We didn't have our own sports until much, much later. I think the first Schutzen, the German sport, landed in the US in the 60s, like the 60s and 70s primarily. And it was super small and it took a long time to grow. And then over the years, we've added other sports. So some of the other sports, the most popular American sport now is PSA, protection sport, right? So that was started by a bunch of, so Jerry Bradshaw was started in Schutzland and police dog stuff, and Joe Morris was in police dog work and that kind of thing. And those guys kind of picked elements of different sports they liked to kind of create their own vision of that. And Mondeo Ring, another sport you mentioned, a sport that I play at, is basically a mix of French ring sport, the French sport, and the Belgian ring sport, the Belgian sport. They wanted an international sport that everybody could compete in, but it's basically a hybrid of those two sports. And so once you get into each of those sports, they're all very different in terms of what they look for, right? The exercises are different. Some are done with suits, some are done with a sleeve, right? Some are, the obedience and the protection are together. Others, they're separate. Some have searching exercises and jumping exercises. Others have less of that, right?
Right.
And so they're wild, and how they judge. Some judge the dog's grip. Some don't judge the dog's grip. The way the decoys are supposed to behave is different, right? Some the decoys are permitted to try to make the dogs miss and do stuff. Others, the decoys have to be very treat every dog the same. Like in Schutzhund or IGP, the dog bites the sleeve, the decoy's all driving the dogs the same way. So they all have a lot of differences. We could spend a weekend talking about the details of them, but each of them's kind of different. Ultimately, a lot of the principles of protection work and stuff are at play in all of them. The dogs have to learn to bite and let go and search and guard and recall and all the other stuff. And then within there, what the aesthetic is for that sport, they're all a little bit different.
Right. So as far as the Malinois, it's safe to say that's your dog of choice, right?
That's my dog. Yeah.
Yeah. So what are some unique traits of the Malinois that you appreciate, and how do these traits impact their training strategies or techniques you use?
Sure. Yeah. So I've been in Malinois now for just a little over 30 years. When I got my first Malinois, I came up with German Shepherds and Bulldogs, American Bulldogs, and Pit Bulls before I got my first Malinois. And
oh wow! Okay.
Yeah, and when I got my first Malinois, I was like, "This is my dog," right?
Gotcha.
They jived, and one of the things is, one, they have a huge amount of drive, right? They have a lot of motivation, right? And another thing that I really like about them that most people don't know is they're sensitive. This is where a lot of people get into trouble with Malinois.
Okay.
Is they see how they are in the bite work. The dogs are super motivated to bite. They're fast. They're really cranked up. And so they look at them as a really tough dog, but they're quite handler sensitive frequently. And I like that in a dog, right? So one of the things that the Malinois is capable of that is very difficult with a lot of other dogs is they can have a huge amount of drive to bite and be put under very high levels of control. They support a lot of control. And part of that is because they're responsive to their handler. And so when I first got the breed, I liked that. People that came directly to Malinois from German Shepherds, when I first got into Malinois, a lot of them had problems because they treated them like a German Shepherd. And German Shepherds, good working German Shepherds, are not particularly sensitive dogs, right? And so you could crank on them a lot and they're like, yeah, whatever, no problem, right? But a lot of Malinois get really, and they don't handle stress well if they don't know what to do. Like if they've been taught well, then you can use pressure on them all you like and they handle it really well. But if they're unclear about what their job is and you put pressure on them, they can come apart on you, right? And they'll bite their handlers. They can know lots of stuff like that, right? But for me, the big things about the Malinois, their athletic ability is amazing, their motivation's incredible, and their responsiveness to their handler is really incredible as well. They are a little more what we call low threshold too. So they have a lot of, so for the average person, you got to be careful with your Malinois because they notice lots of stuff. And if you don't direct their energy properly when they're young, then you can go down a bad road, right? I like to say they're the quintessential trainer's dog. Like if you're really into dog training and you have some experience and you like a dog that will meet you wherever you want to go, meaning like, hey, I want to practice this thing 100 times, then a Malinois is for you, right?
Gotcha.
But if you are a little heavy-handed, you don't like sensitive dogs, you don't like all that energy kind of stuff in them, they can be a real pain in the neck if they're wrong, if they're not your kind of dog, right?
right. Yeah.
So I've learned a lot about management from Malinois, right? You got to be really careful about how you structure their environment when they're young. Once you're past a certain spot, they're great. But during puppyhood and adolescence, if you let them go down the wrong path, they pattern really easily, good and bad directions, right?
Oh, really?
Yeah, they learn super fast. And if they learn the wrong thing, they learn that fast. If they learn the right thing, they learn that fast. So having a well-structured, well-thought-out training program is really important for them.
Gotcha. So you talked about a balanced approach to training dogs, and you said something about 4 things that's entail. Could you name those 4 things earlier? I didn't.
Sure. Yeah. So when we talk about how dogs learn, like I lump it into 3 big categories, right? the first in the four quadrants that I was talking about, the four things there are the four quadrants of operant conditioning or instrumental learning, right? You'll hear people say either one. They'll call it either operant, after B.F. Skinner, the psychologist, coined the term operant conditioning, or instrumental learning, right? And so what that is, that's all the cause and effect stuff in dog training. That's positive reinforcement, negative reinforcement, positive punishment, and negative punishment, right? And so that's where dogs do things or don't do things based on their past experiences, right?
Right.
And so if something's been good, they do more of it. Something's been bad, they do less of it, right? Et cetera, right? And so that's the four quadrants of operant conditioning. That's one piece of the learning puzzle. Another one is what we call classical or Pavlovian conditioning, right? So people usually have heard of this in high school psychology. There was a Russian physiologist named Ivan Pavlov, right? And he was studying digestive processes in dogs. And he's the whole, tone or light flashes, foods dispensed, tone, food, and then tone creates salivation. So most people have been exposed to Pavlovian processes. And so that process he called classical conditioning, or also gets called Pavlovian learning based on that. And that's all the associations the dog makes. If this predicts this, this predicts this, this predicts this, over and over again, the dog may have a physiological response to what was previously a neutral stimulus, right? That's a basic version of classical or Pavlovian conditioning. So operant conditioning, all the cause and effect stuff, the four quadrants, positive reinforcement, positive punishment, negative punishment, classical conditioning, those things are always working together as we train dogs, right? And that's how they learn, us too, humans as well, right? And then the final piece of the puzzle is the emotional state of the dog in learning, right? It's something that didn't used to get talked about a lot, but it's really important. And we were talking about it just a second ago, this idea that the dog's emotional state matters in terms of behavior.
Right.
All behavior isn't just choices the dog makes, right? Some of them are choices based on experience. Some of them are conditioned responses based on Pavlovian or classical conditioning. And some of them are driven by emotion. And dogs in the wrong emotional state won't learn well or will do things that are against their self-interest, just like people do. You're pissed off enough, you do stuff that you know is wrong.
Right.
You know you're going to get in trouble for this. You know this is a bad idea. How often do people do that? All the time. So the idea that you have knowledge of something is going to govern your whole behavior, that outcomes are the only thing that govern behavior, not true. Emotion plays a role. And it's kind of been the discounted role in dog training because it's hard to measure in dogs. We don't know exactly what they're feeling. We're making inferences about what they might be feeling. But we have to take that into account. If the dog's scared, that's what I got to address first. The other stuff doesn't matter until I get that right. If the dog's really frustrated and wound up, I got to pay attention to that emotional state. It's going to affect how they learn, right? All those things will affect it. So those are when I talk about how dogs learn and what we call learning theory, it's that stuff.
Gotcha. So your pet peeves.
Pet peeves.
So I want to ask you about your pet peeves or anything like is there any like techniques, critiques or studies that you think that might be flawed or biased?
Oh God, so many. We're actually a friend of mine, Dr. Stuart Hilliard, who runs the breeding program and ran behavior too for the U.S. military at Lackland Air Force Base for the last 25 years. He and I and my other friend Forrest Mickey, who's a very gifted dog trainer up in Oregon, we have a project right now called Kinology, and we're doing these 5-day kinology workshop symposiums, and we just did the second one. We're doing a third one, and we're creating a whole bunch of video content. But one of the things that we're doing is Dr. Hilliard is doing a systematic review of a lot of the studies on dog training, because there's a lot of dog trainers out there citing studies to prove a point that they want to prove, and the science is either poor, so some of them are not well constructed studies, right? And so they're not telling you what they think they are, or people are making leaps with the information to make it fit their idea of how things work, right? Instead of actually taking it and saying like, hey, we don't know how this applies to dog training. This on the surface maybe, but it has to be tested further. And so we're coming up with at this point a resource, hopefully, which will direct dog trainers to a lot of good research, draw attention to the research that's not so good, right? So unfortunately, right now, a lot of the recent studies that get cited by the force-free community, a lot of those studies are super poorly constructed.
Right.
They're done with inadequate numbers of dogs. The setup doesn't take into account past training on the dog's part. There's a whole variety of things in there, and those are getting cited a lot. And there are certain elements, certain factions of the dog training community that like to say they're doing science-based dog training, but they're kind of cherry picking the science that they're using. Right. And unfortunately, there hasn't up until recently been people with the expertise necessary looking at those things and telling us about the flaws in the study. And so I think here over the next year or so, we're going to have a whole bunch of resources for that stuff. People can go like, hey, you want studies on this topic? Here's a whole list of studies on that topic. You want studies on aversive control? You want studies on shaping behavior, all that kind of stuff. And then here's a methodology for evaluating studies to make sure that they're actually useful information, because there's a lot of bad, poorly done studies out there that get cited. And just because somebody did the study doesn't mean it's telling you any useful information. Right.
Rick, I got somebody in the comments. Rick is asking the guy name you was working with at Lackland's Air Force Base.
Yeah. Dr. Stuart Hilliard.
Dr. Stuart Hilliard.
Yep.
Rick is stationed there.
Yeah, he's in San Antonio. If he's stationed at Lackland, then you ask any of the dog people, they know they know who Dr. Hilliard is. They call him Doc.
Right. So I think I'm gonna stop here and get some questions from the audience.
Sure.
They've been asking me, Joe, get him here. So I ain't gonna take up all the interview. So let me get some of these from the audience. How do you get your dog to trust you when you take them out into the public?
So that has to start away from the public first, right? So that process starts someplace where the dog feels safe, right? So if the dog doesn't trust you in your regular day-to-day interactions, someplace where the dog is comfortable, then they're not going to in public, of course, right? You're adding layers of stress. So that's all the early training and relationship building. So I take the dog out, I kind of figure out what they like and don't like, and we start to do stuff together, and they start to like me, trust me. I behave in a consistent way with them, so they figure me out. I'm not unpredictable. I'm not inconsistent. And then that trust is built, and that trust can then be transferred to new environments. It usually starts with a lot of rewards and me finding out what the dog likes. Like play is a big one for me, right? That's one of the ways that I develop relationships with dogs. I do a lot of play because we use food in training too, but I use a lot of play, and that's a great relationship building place for me, a good stepping off point.
Gotcha. That question was from Gorilla Backs Kennels. Rich Gorilla Backs, old Silverbacks. Okay. Has Mr. Hey Doug, has Mr. Ellis ever worked with Kenny Von Leash? Von Leash Kennels.
Licklider. Yeah. I haven't trained with him, but I met him at a police dog thing many years ago. He's a big broker of police dogs, runs a big police school down south, right? So, but I don't know him personally. We met, but I never trained with him. So,
okay. Here's another one. Has he ever trained any dogs using acting?
Oh, me personally?
Yes, sir.
Train dogs for act? No. Yeah.
Okay.
A bunch of the dogs that I've bred, and friends of mine I grew up in Southern California, so I used to train with Omar von Mueller and OJ Knighton is out there. Like those guys all used to do a ton of movie dogs. So lots of friends in that world, but that was never my jam. No.
Okay, now if we need to find you an agent, let us know now, so we can put you on like Donkey Kong. What abilities, Vicente Moore? What abilities in a dog do you look for in either a police dog or personal protection dog?
So I think I'm going to look at slightly different things for those dogs. Like personal protection dogs, it depends a lot on the the situation they're going in, because that's a pretty variable job, right? They could have a family that like doesn't take the dog a lot of places, that they want the dog around the house, whatever it is. So that's going to be somewhat dependent on the situation the dog's going into. But I would say in general, for my personal protection dogs, I want a super stable dog. Like I want a dog that doesn't exhibit a dog aggression or animal aggression. I want one that's pretty open to strangers, that's not a super suspicious, nervous dog, that basically likes people, and that is really solid, not a twitchy, nervous kind of dog. And then I would gear towards one that was maybe slightly lower energy, right? There, because it's going to fit into a family life easier if the dog's not a go, 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 go all the time kind of dog, right? And so those are the best candidates for personal protection. And a lot of people look for a personal protection dog that's kind of naturally suspicious. It's a bad combo, right? I want a dog that's really stable, then I can show him the specific situations in which I expect him to be aggressive, but I don't want him making those decisions on his own. And a dog that's a little twitchier, a little sharper, a little lower threshold, they can perceive threat in situations that you don't want them to perceive threat in. And a personal protection dog has to have a lot of people coming in and out of its life and stuff like that, unless it's, just a canine bodyguard for somebody and they use it in a very specific spot, right? So that's what I'd say for generally for personal protection. When we talk about police dogs, I want dogs with higher energy levels, because they're going to have to work for longer periods of time. I put a very strong emphasis on environmental soundness as well. The dog has to be really cool in new environments, dark buildings, slippery floors, new places, lots of environmental soundness. And then I want a dog that has a huge amount of search drive, because police dogs are 95% searching, 5% biting. So that dog has to have a lot of natural genetic hunt drive and things like that. And then in the biting, I want basically the same thing, a high threshold dog that really likes to bite, has a bunch of prey drive that I can also make angry if I need to, but in general is a pretty stable dog, right? Yeah, the same kind of thing.
Right. Okay. Best dog show. Thank you. I'm humbled, sir. Let me see. Let me get through some of these questions. Thank you all for the knowledge and experience. All right, Samurai, I'll be talking to you soon as well. Ask Michael about his breedings of Malinois.
All right. So I started breeding Malinois coming up on about 30 years ago. And so the kennel name, my kennel name is Loup du Soleil. It looks like Loups du Soleil, LOUPSDUSO, which means wolves of the sun in French. I did it on a lark. There was a famous, when I first got into Malinois, there was a famous French kennel. I was doing a lot of ring sport stuff at the time, and there's a famous French kennel named Le Mouton, which means like red wolves. And so I'm like, oh, I like that, the wolf thing. And we grew up in San Diego, so Wolves of the Sun, right, was my friend Lisa and I, and we started breeding dogs. Our foundation dogs were mostly Belgian dogs. I got introduced to the Malinois through Belgian ring sport, and so it's, in my opinion, the sport that's had the biggest influence on the breed of the Malinois. The Belgian sport has. And there's not a lot of people doing it anymore, but a lot of the most famous, most influential breeding dogs in Belgium, but also in Germany and France and Holland, have come from that area of Belgium. And all of our original dogs were primarily Belgian, and then we over the years have crossed in French dogs. I try to breed for an all-around dog, and I think by that I mean, if I do my job as a breeder, my dog should be able to be a police dog or a sport dog, either one, right? And they should be able to do any of the dog sports. That said, there are some differences between the bloodlines that do best as police dogs versus the bloodlines that do best as ring sport dogs versus the bloodlines that do best as Schutzhund or IGP dogs, right? There's a different kind of dog. And so you can notice over the years differences in the dogs coming out of Germany versus the dogs coming out of France versus coming out of Holland, etc. And I have landed personally, the dogs that I like are mostly Belgian and French bloodlines mixed together. A lot of, if you're looking for police dogs, you'll see a lot of people like the Dutch dogs. The Dutch dogs make really good police dogs, right? But they're not as good as sport dogs, right? They're a little harder to control. They don't support control quite as well and that kind of thing. They make great cop dogs, but they're not necessarily as good. And I like a dog that I mentioned before, has a lot of drive to bite, has a really good bite, lots of drive to play, but is kind of responsive to the handler, because I like the sports that I do require very high levels of control. Mondia ring is the sport that I compete in most frequently. So you need lots of self-control on the dog's part. And so I like a dog that bites well, but also can be put under control and jumps well. And so over the years, you know, we've whelped 60 to 70 litters over the last 30 years. So yeah, our dogs have been successful, and a lot of our dogs go into the sport that I do because that's where people know who I am. So lots of Mondia ring and French ring dogs, but also IGP dogs, some police dogs and stuff like that too. Yeah, absolutely. I breed for working things, which doesn't mean that they don't make good pets, but I'm assuming they're going to be dogs for work, not lay around the house pet dog. Right?
Do you? This is a big topic on my show because we have a lot of massive breeders, owners, and a lot of talk about protection work. What is your thoughts on defensive trained dogs versus the prey trained dogs? And can a sporting dog, will they do well with a family versus a dog that's kind of geared toward being more just a defensive dog?
So they can be like, so it's the rearing systems are really different. So the kind of dog that I like is a dog that doesn't fall into the category of purely defensive or purely prey based. There are dogs in Malinois, especially, that have what I call bite drive, meaning they just have a ton of drive to bite for its own sake, right? It's a weird thing. It doesn't necessarily require a lot of prey. You don't need a lot of movement sometimes. It's not uncommon to have a 12-week-old Malinois puppy on a harness. And I can bring that thing out and I could just stand there and go tap my arm and stick something out, and they'll just come over and grab it and just start biting, right? I wasn't running around. They're not feeling threatened, right? I'm not putting defensive stress on them. They're just biting because it feels good, and through 100 plus years of selective breeding. So I like a dog that supplies a lot of energy like that. And somebody might say that's prey-based biting, but it doesn't look like traditional prey-based biting, where you're having to whip a thing around, flirt poles and all that kind of, that are more pure prey-based stuff. So I like a dog that has a lot of natural desire to bite, but isn't necessarily feeling threatened at that point in time. And then I typically like a dog of medium threshold for defensive stress, meaning they have enough prey drive and drive to bite on its own that I can work them and keep them out of defense if I want, but they're low enough threshold that if I decide I want to do a little suspicion and defense work, I can elicit a defensive response in them, right? And so I would say the type of dog that I like is medium threshold. And by that, I mean, how easy is it to elicit a defensive response in that dog, right? Some dogs that are very naturally defensive, they're very what we call low threshold. They perceive threat really easily. Like you have the dog there and I just come over and I make eye contact and the dog's like, oh, shoot, right? That's too low threshold. I don't want the dog to be that low threshold. The dog should basically see normal stuff as like, okay, hey, we're just out here playing normal stuff. And then if I push a little, if I start acting weird, I can get a defensive response from them, right? And so I have a tendency like that. For personal protection dogs, generally speaking, most people that have a personal protection dog will lean towards a dog that shows more defensive aggression and less prey-based aggression, because they don't want all the energy that comes with a prey-based dog, right? It's a family dog in a lot of cases, and a lot of the dogs that have a lot of prey drive, you need to find lots of outlets for that, right? So traditionally, people liked a dog that was maybe medium to lower energy even, and maybe didn't have a huge amount of prey drive, but could be activated in defense really easily, right? And that's what they look for a personal protection dog. The problem with that is those dogs can be dangerous a little bit, right? And so I prefer, for personal protection dogs, them to be biased that way a little bit, not as much prey drive and energy as my sport dog would necessarily, right? Not that sport dogs can't make great pets, and my dogs I have 5 Malinois that live in my house, and sleep.
Right.
That so they can make great pets, but it's a lot more work. And I'm a dog trainer, right? So if you take an average family, they don't want a crazy energetic dog that's like, I want to do something all the time. So lower air, but you really need a dog that's more stable, because if the dog's too low threshold for defense, then they're going to perceive threat someplace they're not supposed to.
Right.
And a family dog, somebody takes their eye off the ball, and it's like I said, when Uncle Fred comes over unannounced, and or he's at a party and gets drunk and comes up and gives you a bear hug when you're not the dog lights him up, right? You need a pretty stable dog to be a good personal protection dog. There's a lot of dogs that are personal protection dogs for people that shouldn't be, in my opinion. Like, people should not be doing protection with a lot of the dogs that they're doing protection with, because those dogs are unstable. You need a really strong, stable dog to be a safe personal protection dog.
Right. Hey guys, I'm gonna take 2 more questions, and then I'm gonna let Mr. Ellis go, because let's see here. One type. Okay. What type of play do you do? Rough housing or more of a rapport building?
Yeah. So I do some of both, but most of because it depends on the dog and what I need to activate the dog. Most Malinois, the play is object based and chasing based. So I use tugs and balls and things like that, and I make those move. And if I do any rough stuff, it's kind of pushing the dog and then having them chase an object kind of thing. I'll do some of that type of stuff, right? But with Malinois, it's pretty much always being channeled onto an object. You don't want to rough house a lot with a Malinois without an object involved, because they'll bite you. Like, if you start pushing them and rough housing with them, like I used to keep American Bulldogs. I had American Bulldogs. They loved rough housing. Like you could rough play with them and smack them and shove them and do that sort of stuff, and then throw a toy for them, and they loved that kind of interaction, right? You start pushing on a Malinois without a toy involved, and they get stimulated, and then they want to grab you, and then you're trying to get them to stop grabbing you, and it's all like they get wound up easily. So it's usually toy based, and it's usually tugging and retrieving games, right? But there's lots of ways you can kind of play around with a dog too. Body language wise, I may stand still like this and then run and have the dog chase me. There's a lot of kind of ways you invite play, especially with puppies and stuff like that, to get them just to want to interact with you. But then very quickly, for most of our training dogs, we're channeling that onto objects, and it's going to be tug play, or it's going to be retrieving play. I'm going to throw a ball or throw a frisbee, or we're going to play tug of war, some version of those things.
Gotcha. I gotcha. Okay, shout out from New Zealand. I always shoot. Okay. UK, y'all was getting on me about them shows being too late, so y'all got in here today.
New Zealand, wait for this sometime tomorrow.
Okay. So I saw somebody had this guy, Kyle. How do you breed your lines? And he also had a question about selection. So if you can kind of just tie them in together.
And I'm assuming, does he mean how much inbreeding versus outcrossing?
He want to know your style of breeding.
So I have some foundation bloodlines, some dogs that we started with early on, and that are still the center of my program, meaning all the dogs are descended there. Over the years, I've made various outcrosses at various times. So I have a tendency to like to breed in a fair bit, like line breed and inbreed a fair bit, because you get consistent results, but you always have to be extra selective if you're doing that, making sure that the individuals are both good working candidates and they're also healthy. You've done all your health screening and all your DNA checks and all that kind of stuff on them as much as is possible to make sure that you're not inbreeding on some negative trait, right? So selection's very important when you're starting to inbreed, but you can't inbreed forever. You run into holes, so you need new genetic material. So I would tend to do a little bit of inbreeding or line breeding, and then I look for an appropriate outcross. And when I go for an outcross, I look for a dog that has all the things that I would want in a dog. And there's a few areas that I won't sacrifice on, right? One is gripping style. The other is jumping, and the other is play, right? And the reason for that is those three things are very genetic. Gripping style, how a dog uses its mouth during protection work, is a very genetic behavior. And I can't affect that very much with training. I can affect it a little bit, but not very much, right? And it's the same with jumping. If I'm a really good trainer, I can get a dog to jump better, but I can only affect it so much. And dogs that are natural jumpers, much easier to deal with. And then the final thing is good play habits in the dogs genetically. Because again, I can steer that with good training, but I can't make a dog that doesn't want to play. And so those things, whereas opposed to somebody might say, oh, that dog's a little sensitive. Well, I can really strongly affect that through training. If I get a dog that's a little too sensitive, but they have those other things, then I can build them up, no problem. Like there's lots of training techniques that will make them less sensitive, right? But I can't affect those other things. So my selection, I'm pretty strict on when I go to add an outcross or add a breeding dog to my bloodline. Then when I go to do that, I'm looking for dogs that grip the way I want, play the way I want, jump the way I want. And then we just try it. And usually I'll make a breeding. And if I do an outcross breeding, I'll keep back, I'll put on co-ownerships, a couple of the most promising females so I can see how they mature. And then after that outcross, I have a tendency to go back into the line, the next generation, right? And then I'm going down that line, and then I rinse and repeat over time. Right?
Gotcha.
But the selection process is really important, right?
Yeah. Selection is number one.
And especially if you're going to do any inbreeding, then both temperamental and health selection are really important.
Right. So, Michael, I appreciate you coming here to with us. Man, this is big for us. We're a small channel.
It's my pleasure, man.
Yeah. So, hey, how do I know you got the online classes, and Doug has been putting links to everything you got, but how do you want people to go learn more about you, and where can they learn more about you?
So our website's the landing pad for everything. It's michaelellisschool.com. Okay. And so go there, and it'll have our current membership service and all the content and stuff that we've got going in there. You can see that. I'm on Instagram at Michael_Ellis_school, right? So you can find me there as well. On Facebook, I'm not very active on Facebook, so in that way, in both of those spots, I throw stuff up in those places periodically as well. But the website's the best place to see what we're doing right now. And as I mentioned before, the bulk of what I'm doing right now is going into the membership service. So I'm doing a lot less in-person classes. I'm doing a few seminars a year, but not a lot. And I'm putting recorded versions of classes into the membership, webinars, my video training journal. There's a lot of stuff in there for people to check out.
Okay, cool. All right, that's good to know.
Thank you.
Yeah. Hey, man. Thanks for we enjoyed having you.
Thanks a ton. Great talking with you guys.
Okay. All right. See you, Mike.
Catch you later.
Okay. Bye.